It's late 2001, and a gas station off the New Jersey Turnpike is about to become a war zone. On one side, Arnold Squitieri, the acting boss of the Gambino crime family, has brought 20 armed Italian mobsters carrying bats and guns. On the other, an Albanian immigrant named Alex Rudaj has shown up with just 6 men. Squitieri tells Rudaj the fun is over. Stop expanding. Stop taking our territory. Back off or else. Both sides pull their weapons. The Italians have the numbers, 3-1. But then one of Rudaj's enforcers, a man named Nicola Dedaj, known on the streets as Nicky Nails, does something that stuns every single person at that gas station. He points a shotgun directly at a fuel pump, finger on the trigger, and makes it clear that if anyone fires a single round, he'll blow the entire station sky high, killing every last one of them. Squitieri and his 20 soldiers had no answer for that. They backed down, got in their cars, and left. The Gambino crime family, the most feared organization in New York, had just been stared down by 6 Albanians at a gas station. And this wasn't a one-off act of desperation. This was a calculated declaration of war against the entire Italian mob. If you're into organized crime stories that don't get the attention they deserve, hit that subscribe button right now. We cover the most overlooked and dangerous criminal organizations in America every single week. To understand how a handful of Albanian immigrants ended up going toe-to-toe with New York's 5 established mafia families, you need to understand where these men came from and what they survived before they ever set foot on American soil. Albania spent decades under the iron grip of Enver Hoxha, a communist dictator whose regime became the most repressive totalitarian government in all of Europe. In 1967, Hoxha outlawed every form of religion in the country. His secret police, the Sigurimi, watched everyone. Citizens couldn't leave. The economy was destroyed. Albanian society was stripped of its traditions, its moral structures, and its sense of self-respect through decades of systematic terror. When communism finally collapsed across the Balkans in the early 1990s, Albania attempted a shaky transition to democracy. But the country was desperately poor, its infrastructure was crumbling, and its people were starving for any opportunity they could find. Then came the pyramid schemes. During the mid-1990s, with Albania's financial system in complete shambles, roughly 2/3 of the country's citizens invested their life savings into Ponzi-style schemes run by former government agents and con artists. At their peak, the total liabilities of these schemes amounted to nearly half of Albania's entire GDP. And when they collapsed in 1997, the majority of investors lost everything overnight. The country exploded. Mass rioting swept through every city. Opposition parties opened the prisons and released the inmates. Military weapons were abandoned across the country, free for the taking. One young Albanian, who would later be convicted of murder in Michigan, remembered 1997 vividly. He was 17 years old, sitting outside a mechanic shop with his friends, when a car pulled up, and a man inside pointed an AK-47 at one of his friends and shot him dead right there. No reason, no warning, no consequences. That was daily life in Albania in 1997. A country where children were kicked out of government-sponsored orphanages, where thieves ran rampant through every town, and where the new government turned out to be just as corrupt as the communist regime it replaced. This was the Albania that shaped the men who would later terrorize New York's criminal underworld. They weren't businessmen trying to assimilate into the American dream. They were survivors of a nation's collapse, civil war, and a regime that had imprisoned them behind closed borders for decades. They arrived in America hungry, traumatized, and willing to do whatever it took to survive. But they also brought something with them that made them different from every other criminal organization the FBI had ever encountered. They brought Besa, usually translated as faith or trust. Besa is more accurately understood as keeping the honor. It's a concept rooted in the canon, a set of traditional Albanian laws dating back to at least the 15th century. Originally passed down through oral tradition, Besa functioned as a blood oath, the highest authority in Albanian culture. Criminal gangs formed by men who were related or who had known each other since childhood were bound together for life by this code. Betrayal wasn't just discouraged, it was virtually unthinkable. FBI supervising agent Lou De Gregorio, who had spent 20 years investigating the Italian Mafia, kept a copy of the canon on his desk. He said the Albanians reminded him of the old-school Italian mob before the American-born generation softened it. Still poor, still hungry, and still desperate. And critically, still impossible to flip. Now, back to New York. Albanians had been arriving in the city since the 1960s, initially settling in Italian neighborhoods in the Bronx. But it was after the 1997 collapse that Albanian crime groups rapidly expanded across the East Coast. And the man who would take their ambitions further than anyone thought possible was Alex Rudaj. Rudaj was an ethnic Albanian from Ulkin, Montenegro, who immigrated to the United States in 1987. By the early 1990s, he realized he could use Albanian muscle to form his own crew. He partnered with Nardino Colotti, an Italian who had ties to Gambino soldier Skinny Phil Loscalzo. Loscalzo had promised Colotti territory and rackets to run in the Bronx, along with a proposal for Gambino family membership. But when Loscalzo died, a Sicilian Gambino soldier named Joe Gambino took over his operations instead. Rudaj and Colotti received nothing. No territory, no membership, no respect. So they took matters into their own hands. In 1993, they founded what members would come to call the Corporation. Slowly, Rudaj, Colotti, and a growing crew of Albanian, Italian, Greek, and Arab gangsters began taking over illegal gambling operations in the Morris Park and Arthur Avenue areas of the Bronx, then spread into Westchester County. The gambling dens generated millions of dollars annually. But what made the corporation different from the Italian families was its multi-ethnic composition. While the 5 families were traditionally Italian-only at their core, Rudaj didn't care about ethnicity. He cared about loyalty and willingness to use violence. His soldiers came from all backgrounds, united by one thing. They answered to Rudaj, and they followed the code. By the late 1990s, the corporation had established a serious footprint across the Bronx, Westchester, and parts of Queens. But Rudaj wasn't satisfied with the scraps the Italians allowed him. He wanted their territory, and he was willing to become extremely disrespectful to get it. If you're still watching at this point, you already know this story is about to get a lot crazier. Make sure you're subscribed because we've got even wilder stories coming soon on this channel that you absolutely do not want to miss. Rudaj himself had already proven he was willing to pull the trigger personally. Federal prosecutors later described a 1996 incident where Rudaj was the triggerman in a high-speed shooting through the Bronx. He hung out the sunroof of a moving car and fired at a man named Guy Peduto, as Peduto fled in another vehicle. This wasn't a boss who gave orders from a safe distance. This was a man who did his own dirty work, and his crew respected him for it. The corporation's first major offensive against the Italian families came in August 2001. Rudaj and his enforcer, Luza Nukalovic, led at least 6 armed men into a Greek social club called Soccer Fever in Astoria, Queens. The club was a gambling operation overseen by Greek associates of the Lucchese crime family. Rudaj's crew burst in with guns, beat patrons, overturned gambling tables, grabbed cash, knocked one player unconscious, and made it very clear that they were now in charge of illegal gambling in Astoria. This wasn't some sloppy robbery. This was a calculated power move against one of New York's 5 established mafia families. And the Italians noticed. That's when Gambino acting boss Arnold Squitieri called for the sit-down at the gas station off the New Jersey Turnpike, the same standoff that opened this video. After Nicky Nails pointed that shotgun at the fuel pump and the Gambinos backed down, talks were held. Rudaj was eventually pressured into slowing his expansion, but the message had already been sent. The Albanians weren't afraid of anyone, and Rudaj was just getting started. After Colotti met with Anthony Megali, the Gambino family's second-in-command, and negotiated terms following the Soccer Fever raid, Colotti continued to serve as the bridge between the Albanians and the Italian mob. Federal agents watched him sit down with Joseph Caridi, the consigliere of the Lucchese family, after Rudaj began muscling into Lucchese gambling houses as well. The corporation was hitting multiple families at once, and they didn't seem to care about the consequences. In another incident, Rudaj, Colotti, and Nicky Nails attacked and beat a bar owner who owed them money. When the man refused to pay and hand over his bar, Colotti tried to bite his ear off while Nicky Nails shoved a gun in his face. Federal prosecutor Jennifer Rogers later detailed these brutal beatings in court, stating that fear was the corporation's chief means of control. One defendant was praised within the crew for strangling an old man with a shoelace until, as the court record described it, his eyes were popping out of his head. Another member complained that a beating victim had dirtied his pants with blood. Nicky Nails himself described the corporation's expansion strategy in characteristically blunt terms. They make mistakes somewhere. We move in and take it. And that's exactly what they did. While the Italian Mafia's leadership was being locked up in the early 2000s, particularly the Gambino family administration, the Albanians moved fast and seized territory the Italians could no longer protect. But the moment that truly defined the corporation's audacity, the moment that made every wise guy in New York sit up and pay attention, came at Rao's, the legendary Italian restaurant in East Harlem. Rao's is a 10-table institution that has been operating since 1896. You don't make a reservation. You either have a permanent table assignment or you know someone who does. The waiting list doesn't exist because tables are passed down through families, like inheritance. Notable patrons over the decades included Lucky Luciano, Paul Castellano, and John Gotti himself, the most famous mob boss in American history, who had his own permanent table at the restaurant for years. In 2003, 1 year after Gotti died of cancer while serving a life sentence in a tiny 23-hour lockdown prison cell, Alex Rudaj walked into Rouse and demanded Gotti's old table. When the staff refused, Rudaj left. Then he came back with dozens of his crew. After a short and very threatening conversation with the restaurant's owner, the table became his. Just like that. Think about what that means for a second. An Albanian immigrant who had been in the country for barely 15 years walked into the most exclusive mafia restaurant in New York City and took the table of the most famous mob boss in American history. By force. That single act told the entire New York underworld that the corporation considered itself an equal to the 5 families. Fred Snelling, the head of the FBI's criminal division in New York, would later say publicly that what they had on their hands might be considered a 6th crime family. But nothing good lasts forever. And in Rudaj's case, it didn't last very long at all. The FBI had been building their case for 5 years. Up to a dozen agents worked the investigation using wiretaps, surveillance operations, and informants embedded close to the organization. On October the 26th, 2004, the FBI and Manhattan U.S. Attorney David Kelly announced the arrest of Alex Rudaj and 21 other members of the corporation. The charges included racketeering, attempted murder, extortion, and illegal gambling. Kelly's office called it the first federal racketeering case in the United States against an organized crime enterprise run by Albanians. The trial lasted 3 months. The prosecution laid out the full scope of the corporation's operations, from the gambling dens in the Bronx and Queens to the violent confrontations with the Italian families. Jurors heard about the gas station standoff, the soccer fever raid, the beatings, the stranglings, and the brazen takeover of territory from multiple mafia families simultaneously. They heard wiretapped conversations and testimony from informants that painted a picture of an organization that operated through pure intimidation. The defense tried to argue that Rudaj was nothing more than a small-time gambler, but the evidence was overwhelming. On June 16, 2006, Alex Rudaj, then 38 years old, was sentenced to 27 years in federal prison. Nardino Colotti received the same sentence. Nikola Dedak, the man who had pointed that shotgun at the gas pump, also received significant time. Over 20 members of the organization were ultimately charged. 6 top leaders were convicted at trial, and 10 more pleaded guilty. The 6th family had risen and fallen in just over a decade. But here's the thing about Albanian organized crime. When you take out the leadership, there is no obvious successor waiting in the wings like there would be in an Italian family. The lack of a rigid hierarchy that made the Albanians so hard to penetrate also made them nearly impossible to truly destroy. New crews formed, new territories were claimed, new names replaced old ones, but the methods stayed the same. The FBI, Europol, and Interpol all continued to list Albanian organized crime as one of the fastest growing criminal threats in the world. By the 2010s, Albanian networks were responsible for distributing up to 40% of the heroin consumed in Europe, with tentacles reaching into Australia, the Middle East, and South America. Even the prosecutor who helped bring Rudaj down acknowledged the reality of the situation. You can lock up the leaders, but the organization adapts. The Albanian crews do not have the rigid family structure that makes Italian mafia families vulnerable to RICO cases. They are fluid, they reform, and because of Besa, they almost never cooperate with law enforcement. Rudaj himself, if his sentence runs its full course, could be released within the next few years. He will return to a New York that looks very different from the one he terrorized. But the gangland scene itself has not really changed. Only the names have. That's the story of how a crew of Albanian immigrants, bound by an ancient code of honor and fueled by decades of trauma, stared down the 5 most established criminal organizations in America and earned themselves a seat at the table, even if that seat didn't last. If this story gripped you, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel right now. We go deep on the most dangerous and overlooked criminal organizations operating in America, and we've got a lot more coming. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And if you want to see the full story of how the Albanian Mafia expanded beyond New York and went global, that video is on screen now.